Good evening, friends. This is David Warren, and I welcome you to another chapter of The Unknown Presidents. Today's unknown president will be our 17th president, Andrew Johnson, who served from 1865 to 1869. To give you the story of Andrew Johnson, I will turn the program over to Colonel Kensington. Colonel, tell us all about Andrew Johnson.
Thank you very much, Dave. Well now, Andrew Johnson, our 17th president, he was born in Raleigh, North Carolina. And you know the poor man never went to school a day in his life. He had absolutely no formal education. He couldn't read or write, not for a long time. He was a tailor by trade, and they say that he actually made all his own clothes. He met a very young, pretty lady named Eliza McCardle. And he married her when she was but 16 years old. And it was she who taught Andrew how to read and write. And so she, in effect, became his teacher. Andrew was a rather stubborn individual, very headstrong. He entered politics, and when the South seceded from the Union, he was a Southerner through and through. He lived at that time in the state of Tennessee, but he decided to remain loyal to the Union, and he was a Democrat. But in 1864, when Abraham Lincoln was running for re-election, to reward Johnson for his loyalty, Lincoln, a Republican, chose Johnson, a Democrat, as his vice president. And so, on Inauguration Day, Lincoln was sworn in for a second term, and Andrew Johnson was sworn in as his vice president. And the story goes that on Lincoln's Inauguration Day, that Andrew Johnson, the vice president, had a bad cold and had imbibed in some brandy and got drunk at Lincoln's inauguration, which highly embarrassed Abraham Lincoln. But of course, as we all know how events turned out, just scarcely a month later, after his second inaugural, Lincoln was assassinated. And Andrew Johnson became the new president. Andrew Johnson had a very stormy relationship with Congress. He was determined to follow through with Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, but the radical Republicans led by Thaddeus Stevens would have no take with that, and they opposed Johnson at every turn, everywhere that they could. They passed a series of very unconstitutional acts, one of them called the Tenure of Office Act, which said that the president could not dismiss a cabinet member without the approval of the Senate. Well, Johnson did anyway. He put them to the test, and he fired the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Yes, Stanton opposed Johnson at every turn, and so Johnson fired him. And so the House of Representatives decided to impeach President Johnson. They were determined to throw him out of office. And the Senate had a lot of the votes they needed to throw him out. There was only one in question, Senator Edmund Ross of Kansas. Ross at first agreed with the people who wanted to oust Johnson, but he began to have strange feelings about it. And wasn't sure when the day came to vote what he was going to do. But so sure was the Senate that they were going to kick Johnson out that the President pro tem of the Senate, Ben Wade, who was next in line, since Johnson had no vice president, Ben Wade was going to be the new president, and he had already chosen a cabinet. Well, on the day that Ross came to vote, to make sure that he was going to vote the way that they wanted him to, the Republicans found this man, Daniel Sickles, an old Gettysburg War hero, a very convincing gentleman, to intercede and talk to Edmund Ross and to convince him to vote to kick Johnson out of office. Well, it so happened that in Washington there lived a very young, pretty sculptress named Vinnie Ream. Yes, Vinnie Ream. She was working on a bust, on a life-size head of the late President Lincoln. And she was very familiar with many of the senators and congressmen in Washington of the day. They would often stop by to visit the vivacious young lady. And her favorite was Senator Ross of Kansas. And she liked him a lot. Well, word got to her what the Republicans were planning on doing. And so, on the day that Ross was coming in to vote, Vinnie Ream went over to the Senate building and found Daniel Sickles and asked him if he would accompany her back to her studio to give his opinion on the bust of Abraham Lincoln. Thereby, Sickles did not have a chance to talk to Ross before he entered the Senate chamber to vote. And Ross decided to vote not guilty. And Andrew Johnson was acquitted by one vote. And therefore, Andrew Johnson remained as President of the United States. However, quite unfortunately for him, his usefulness as a president was over, and he simply served out the rest of Lincoln's term, not being elected to a term of his own. And so Andrew Johnson left Washington a very hated man. However, a few years later, Johnson was actually elected to the Senate from Tennessee. He's the only ex-president to be elected to the Senate. And Johnson was a senator until he suffered a stroke while visiting his daughter. And he died on July the 31st of 1875. And his last words reportedly were, "Oh, do not cry, children, be good all of you, and we shall meet in heaven." And Johnson has requested by him, his body was wrapped in an American flag, and a copy of the Constitution was placed beneath his head, and he was buried in such a manner. And so there is the story of our 17th president, Andrew Johnson.
Excellent job, Colonel. Thank you. All right. So goes the story of Andrew Johnson. That's all today, my friends. We'll be back later in the week with another story of an unknown president. Until then, this is David Warren. Back to you, Wolf.